When we think about the most notorious serial killers in American history, names like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy immediately come to mind. Their crimes have been dissected in countless documentaries, books, and films. But lurking in the shadows of criminal history are equally terrifying predators whose names have largely escaped public consciousness. These are killers whose body counts rival the most infamous murderers, whose methods were just as brutal, and whose ability to evade justice was sometimes even more chilling. Today, we're diving into the dark world of 5 serial killers you've probably never heard of, but whose crimes will haunt you long after you hear their stories. Donald Harvey worked in hospitals for 17 years. During that time, he claimed the lives of at least 37 people, though he confessed to killing 87. His victims trusted him. They were vulnerable, sick, and completely at his mercy. Harvey didn't use guns or knives. But Harvey wasn't motivated by mercy. He was motivated by something far more sinister, something that would only be fully understood when investigators finally caught him in 1987. Born on April 15, 1952, in Hamilton, Ohio, Donald Harvey grew up in a world that seemed ordinary on the surface. But beneath that normalcy, something dark was taking root. His childhood was marked by dysfunction and early signs of the monster he would become. Harvey later claimed he was sexually abused by an uncle and a neighbor, experiences that he said shaped his twisted worldview. By his teens, Harvey was already displaying concerning behavior. He was fascinated by death, spent time in cemeteries, and showed an unusual interest in funeral homes and morgues. At 18, Harvey found his calling when he began working at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. It was here in 1970 that Harvey committed his first known murder. His victim was Logan Evans, an 88-year-old patient who had angered Harvey by smearing feces on him during a moment of confusion. Rather than simply cleaning up and moving on, Harvey made a decision that would define the next 17 years of his life. He smothered Evans with a pillow, watching as the life drained from the old man's eyes. In that moment, Harvey discovered something terrifying about himself. He liked it. What made Harvey so dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill, but his intelligence and cunning. He understood that hospitals were the perfect hunting ground. Death was expected there. Patients died regularly, and rarely did anyone question why. Harvey could kill with impunity, and for years that's exactly what he did. He developed a sophisticated arsenal of methods. Sometimes he used pillows to smother patients. Other times, he injected air bubbles into IV lines, causing fatal embolisms. But Harvey's preferred weapons were poisons. He had access to arsenic, which he would slip into food or drinks. He used cyanide, injecting it directly into IV bags or mixing it with orange juice. He even experimented with household cleaners, finding ways to make murders look like natural deaths. Harvey's victims weren't just terminally ill patients, as he would later claim. They included recovering patients, visitors, and even fellow hospital employees who had somehow crossed him. He killed an ex-lover's husband out of jealousy. He murdered patients who were rude to him or who complained about their care. He even killed people simply because he was bored or wanted to see if he could get away with it. Harvey later admitted that he enjoyed the power he held over life and death. He described the rush he felt when deciding who would live and who would die, comparing it to playing God. For 17 years, Harvey moved between hospitals across Ohio and Kentucky, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. He worked at Marymount Hospital, the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Cincinnati, and Drake Memorial Hospital, among others. At each facility, mortality rates mysteriously increased during his shifts. Patients who were expected to recover suddenly died. But Harvey was careful. He spaced out his killings, varied his methods, and maintained the facade of a caring, dedicated healthcare worker. Colleagues described him as quiet, reliable, and compassionate. Some even called him their favorite orderly. The beginning of the end came in March 1987, when Harvey was working at Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati. He had administered a fatal dose of cyanide to 78-year-old John Powell, a patient recovering from a minor illness. But Harvey made a critical error. He used too much poison. When Dr. Lee Lehman performed the autopsy, the smell of cyanide was unmistakable. It smelled like bitter almonds, a telltale sign that immediately raised red flags. For the first time in Harvey's long career, someone had detected his handiwork. Hospital administrators were contacted, and an investigation began. When confronted, Harvey initially denied any wrongdoing, but as evidence mounted, his carefully constructed facade began to crumble. On April 6, 1987, Harvey was arrested and charged with murder. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, Harvey made a decision that would shock investigators. He confessed. But his confession wasn't just an admission of guilt for one murder. It was a detailed account of nearly 2 decades of systematic killing. Sitting in the interrogation room, Harvey calmly recounted his crimes with chilling precision. He described each method of murder, explained his motivations, and provided details that only the killer could know. He confessed to 37 murders that could be verified, but claimed the actual number was closer to 87. Some victims, he said, he had killed so long ago that he couldn't remember all the details. Others had been cremated, making it impossible to confirm the cause of death. Harvey showed no remorse during his confession. Instead, he seemed almost proud of his accomplishments, describing his kills with the detached professionalism of someone discussing their career achievements. The scope of Harvey's crimes was staggering. He had been killing for 17 years, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. His victim count rivaled some of the most notorious murderers, yet his name remained largely unknown outside of Ohio and Kentucky. The reason was simple. Harvey's crimes lacked the sensational elements that capture media attention. There were no dramatic chases, no taunting letters to police, no elaborate crime scenes. Harvey's murders were quiet, clinical, and hidden within the sterile walls of medical facilities. During his trial, Harvey's defense team attempted to paint him as a mercy killer, someone who had ended the suffering of terminally ill patients. But prosecutors systematically destroyed this narrative. They showed that many of Harvey's victims were recovering and expected to go home. They demonstrated that Harvey had killed out of anger, boredom, and a desire for control, not compassion. The jury wasn't fooled by the mercy killer defense. They saw Harvey for what he truly was, a cold-blooded predator who had used his position of trust to commit unthinkable crimes. On August 18, 1987, Harvey pleaded guilty to 24 counts of murder in Ohio and 4 counts in Kentucky to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in shackles, Harvey showed no emotion. He had escaped execution, and that seemed to be all that mattered to him. The families of his victims weren't satisfied with the sentence, but they took some comfort in knowing that Harvey would never again have the opportunity to harm another innocent person. Harvey spent the remainder of his life behind bars at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. He rarely granted interviews and showed no interest in explaining his actions beyond his initial confession. Fellow inmates largely avoided him, viewing him as the worst kind of predator. Even in a prison full of murderers and violent criminals, Harvey was considered an outcast. On March 30th, 2017, Harvey's reign of terror finally came to an end when he died in prison at the age of 64. His death was violent and fitting for someone who had caused so much suffering. He was beaten to death by his cellmate, a fellow murderer who apparently decided that Harvey deserved to experience the fear and pain he had inflicted on so many others. The case of Donald Harvey reveals the terrifying vulnerability of patients in medical settings and the trust we place in healthcare workers. It also highlights how serial killers can hide in plain sight, using their positions and our assumptions about their professions to commit horrific crimes. Harvey's story serves as a chilling reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Moving from the sterile halls of hospitals to the streets of Gary, Indiana, our next killer operated in plain sight, preying on society's most vulnerable. While Donald Harvey hid behind medical scrubs, Darren Dion Vaughn needed no disguise. He was a predator in the truest sense, and his hunting ground was the forgotten corners of America's Rust Belt. On October 18, 2014, police in Hammond, Indiana, responded to what seemed like a routine call. A young woman named Africa Hardy had been found dead in a motel room. She was only 19 years old, a sex worker trying to survive in an unforgiving world. What investigators discovered next would expose one of the most chilling serial killing sprees in recent memory. The man they arrested was Darren Dion Vaughn, a towering figure at 6 feet tall with cold, calculating eyes. Born on March 21, 1971, Van had spent most of his life drifting between violence and brief periods of apparent normalcy. But when police brought him in for questionings about Africa's murder, something unexpected happened. He didn't deny it. Instead, he began to talk, and what he revealed sent shockwaves through law enforcement. Vaughn calmly confessed to killing 6 more women, all in the Gary, Indiana area. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. He told detectives he could show them where the bodies were. Over the next several days, Van led police on a macabre tour through Gary's abandoned landscape, pointing out houses where he had dumped the remains of his victims. One by one, they found them. 7 women in total, all strangled, all discarded like garbage in a city that had already been left to decay. The victims were Aneth Jones, 19 years old, Tayira Beatty, 28, Christine Williams, 36, Sonia Billingsley, 53, Tracy Martin, 41, Tanya Gatlin, 27, and Africa Hardy, the victim whose death had started it all. These weren't random killings. Van had specifically targeted sex workers, women who operated on the margins of society, women whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. But even as Van confessed to these 7 murders, investigators suspected there was much more to his story. In recorded interviews, he claimed to have killed dozens more women across multiple states: Illinois, California, North Carolina, Texas, Wisconsin, Michigan. He spoke of Chicago as a particular hunting ground, describing how he would travel from state to state, seeking out vulnerable women to satisfy his murderous compulsions. What made Van particularly dangerous was his mobility and his method. He was methodical, patient, and utterly without remorse. He would often meet his victims through escort websites or on the street, luring them with the promise of money. Once he had them isolated, he would strangle them with his bare hands, watching the life drain from their eyes. The act of killing wasn't frenzied or passionate for Van. It was calculated, deliberate, almost businesslike in its efficiency. The warning signs had been there for years, scattered across his criminal record like breadcrumbs leading to inevitable tragedy. Van had served in the United States Marine Corps, but received an other than honorable discharge in 1993 after less than 2 years of service. His military records showed a pattern of behavioral problems and an inability to conform to military discipline. In 2004, he was arrested in Gary for threatening his girlfriend with gasoline and a lighter, a terrifying glimpse into his capacity for violence. The charges resulted in only a 90-day jail sentence, a slap on the wrist that did nothing to address the deeper psychological issues driving his behavior. But the most damning failure of the justice system came in 2009 when Van was convicted of sexual assault in Texas. Here's where the system's failures become almost incomprehensible. Van served 5 years in a Texas state penitentiary and was released in July 2013, just over a year before he would begin his confirmed killing spree in Indiana. The Texas prosecutors who handled his case may not have been fully aware of his previous conviction in Indiana, which could have resulted in a much longer sentence under habitual offender laws. Instead, they offered him a plea deal that put him back on the streets with years of pent-up rage and a refined understanding of how to avoid detection. Those who knew Van described him as a loner who would mumble to himself and seemed to carry an invisible weight of anger. His personal life was a series of failed relationships and mounting frustrations. He had been married to a woman 30 years his senior, but that relationship ended in divorce in 2011. Friends and acquaintances noted that he seemed to harbor deep resentment toward women, particularly those he perceived as having wronged him. What made Van's crimes particularly heinous was his targeting of sex workers, women who were already living in dangerous circumstances with little protection from law enforcement or society at large. He understood that these women were vulnerable, that their disappearances might not trigger immediate, intensive investigations, and that their lifestyles made them easy targets for someone with his predatory instincts. Gary, Indiana, provided the perfect hunting ground for someone like Van. Once a thriving industrial city, Gary had fallen into severe economic decline, leaving behind a landscape of abandoned buildings and forgotten neighborhoods. The city's population had plummeted from over 170,000 in the 1960s to fewer than 80,000 by 2014. Entire blocks stood empty, creating countless locations where someone could dispose of bodies without immediate discovery. The abandoned houses where Van dumped his victims told their own story of urban decay and societal neglect. These weren't just crime scenes. They were symbols of how entire communities had been left behind, creating spaces where predators could operate with impunity. When police searched these locations, they found the women's bodies in various states of decomposition, some wrapped in plastic, others simply left to rot in the ruins of America's former industrial heartland. During his interrogations, Van displayed a chilling matter-of-factness about his crimes. He spoke about killing with the same emotional detachment that someone might use to describe their daily commute. There was no remorse, no apparent recognition of the humanity of his victims. Instead, he seemed almost proud of his ability to evade capture for so long, describing his methods with clinical precision. When asked about his motives, Vaughn's answers revealed a man driven by rage and a need for control. He described seeking an out for his anger, and he had found that outlet in the systematic murder of vulnerable women. The act of strangling his victims gave him a sense of power and dominance that he apparently couldn't find elsewhere in his life. The investigation into Van's crimes revealed disturbing patterns that suggested his killing spree had been far more extensive than initially believed. Phone records showed him traveling frequently between states, often coinciding with unsolved murders of sex workers in various jurisdictions. The decentralized nature of American law enforcement, with its thousands of separate agencies and limited information sharing, had allowed Van to operate across state lines without triggering coordinated investigations. In May 2018, Darren Dion Vaughn was sentenced to 7 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. He had accepted a plea agreement to avoid the death penalty, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But even as he disappeared into the prison system, questions remained about the full extent of his crimes. The families of his confirmed victims were left to grapple with losses that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of their loved ones' deaths. These women had been daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. They had dreams, fears, hopes for better futures. Vaughn had reduced them to objects for his violent fantasies, but their families and communities remembered them as human beings whose lives had value and meaning. The case of Darren Dion Vaughn serves as a stark reminder of how serial killers often target society's most vulnerable members, exploiting the gaps in our social safety net and the prejudices that make some victims seem less worthy of protection than others. His crimes also highlight the critical importance of information sharing between law enforcement agencies and the need for more comprehensive approaches to tracking violent offenders across jurisdictional boundaries. Today, Van sits in prison, his mobility finally constrained, his hunting days over. Our next killer operated under the perfect cover, the medical profession. In hospitals and nursing homes, death is expected, routine, almost invisible. This made David Edward Moust one of the most dangerous predators imaginable, a man who used society's trust in healthcare workers to satisfy his twisted need for control over life and death. David Moust was born on April 5th, 1954, in Connellsville, Pennsylvania, into a world that seemed determined to break him from the start. His parents divorced when he was just 7 years old, leaving him in the care of his mother, a woman described by court records as mentally ill and psychotic. At age 9, his own mother had him committed to a mental institution, claiming he had set fire to his younger brother's bed and tried to drown him in a bathtub. Whether these accusations were true or the delusions of a disturbed woman, the damage was done. David was labeled dangerous before he even reached double digits. The institution was no refuge. At age 13, David was moved to a children's home where he was subjected to repeated sexual abuse by older residents and staff members. These weren't isolated incidents, but systematic violations that warped his understanding of power, control, and human relationships. By the time he reached adulthood, David had learned that the world was divided into predators and prey, and he had no intention of remaining prey. Army and was stationed in Germany. For a brief moment, it seemed like military structure might provide the stability he had never known. Instead, it became the stage for his first known murder. In 1974, David encountered 13-year-old James McClister, the son of American expatriates living in Germany. What happened next revealed the monster that had been growing inside him for years. David lured James to a secluded area where he strangled the boy with his bare hands. But killing wasn't enough. David sexually assaulted the corpse, then dismembered the body with clinical precision. He scattered the remains across multiple locations, believing he could make James simply disappear. When investigators found the body parts, David was arrested and charged with murder. However, due to jurisdictional complications and what prosecutors later called inadequate investigation, he was convicted only of involuntary manslaughter and larceny. He served just 4 years in a German prison. Here's where the system failed catastrophically. They labeled him a high suicide and homicide risk, recommending he never be released without intensive supervision. David himself begged not to be paroled, telling officials he would kill again if freed. But in 1977, he was released anyway. David returned to the United States and settled in Chicago, where he attempted to blend into normal life. He worked odd jobs, kept a low profile, and for a few years seemed to control his violent urges. But in 1981, the mask began to slip. David stabbed a friend while the man slept, claiming later that he had been having nightmares about his childhood abuse. Incredibly, when the case went to trial, David lied on the witness stand about his military record and previous conviction, and the jury found him not guilty. The system had failed again. Later that same year, David's rage finally found a new target. Unable to locate a man who had molested him as a juvenile, David decided that any victim would satisfy his need for revenge. He selected 15-year-old Donald Jones, a boy who had never harmed anyone, whose only crime was being in the wrong place when David's fury needed an outlet. David approached Donald near a Chicago quarry, engaging him in casual conversation before suddenly attacking. The murder was brutal beyond description. David stabbed Donald repeatedly in the abdomen, watching as the boy screamed and bled. When Donald tried to crawl away, David grabbed him and threw him into the quarry water. But David wasn't finished. He climbed down into the water and held Donald's head beneath the surface, watching the life drain from his eyes. The boy's body was discovered days later, but David had vanished. For 13 years, David remained free. He moved frequently, working in hospitals and nursing homes across the Midwest, always using false identifications and forged credentials. During this time, investigators believe he killed repeatedly, targeting elderly patients and disabled individuals who couldn't fight back or call for help. His methods were sophisticated. He used untraceable poisons, induced heart attacks through medication manipulation, and caused accidents that appeared natural. The exact number of his victims during this period may never be known, but estimates range from 12 to over 30 people. David's ability to evade capture was enhanced by the transient nature of healthcare work. He would take temporary positions, kill several patients, then move to another facility before patterns could be detected. Hospital administrators, desperate for staff and lacking sophisticated background check systems, rarely questioned his credentials. Death in these facilities was so common that a few extra fatalities barely registered. In 1994, advances in forensic technology finally caught up with David. DNA evidence from the Donald Jones murder scene was matched to samples taken during his earlier arrest. When police tracked him down, he was working at a nursing home in Indiana under an assumed name. Rather than face trial, David pleaded guilty to Donald's murder, calculating that a life sentence was preferable to the death penalty he would likely receive. During his confession, David revealed details that chilled even seasoned investigators. He described how he selected victims based on their vulnerability, how he planned each murder to appear natural, and how he felt a rush of power with each death. He spoke about his childhood abuse not as an excuse, but as the catalyst that taught him violence was the ultimate form of control. Most disturbing of all, he expressed no remorse for his victims, viewing them merely as objects that had served their purpose. David was sentenced to 35 years in prison, with credit for 11 years already served. Prison psychiatrists again documented his severe mental illness and recommended he never be released. But incredibly, in June 1999, David was granted parole after serving only 18 years total. His supervised release ended in June 2002, and once again, he was free to kill. David immediately returned to his old patterns. He rented a basement apartment in Hammond, Indiana, and began targeting teenage boys in the area. Local kids knew him as Crazy Dave, a strange man who offered them money for odd jobs around his property. What they didn't know was that David was carefully selecting his next victims. In May 2003, 19-year-old Nick James accepted David's offer to help with some yard work. Nick was struggling financially and thought the job would provide some quick cash. Instead, he became David's first victim after his release. David strangled Nick in his basement, then wrapped the body in plastic sheeting and entombed it in concrete, creating a makeshift grave beneath his floor. In September 2003, David claimed two more victims. 13-year-old Michael Dennis and 16-year-old James Regani were friends who often hung out together in the neighborhood. David approached them separately, offering each boy money for different jobs. When they arrived at his house, David overpowered them, strangled them both, and buried their bodies alongside Nick's remains. For 3 months, David lived above the concrete tomb containing 3 corpses. Neighbors occasionally complained about strange smells coming from his apartment, but David explained them away as sewer problems or dead animals. He continued his daily routine, going to work, shopping for groceries, even hosting visitors, all while 3 bodies decomposed beneath his feet. David's downfall came through his own arrogance. In December 2003, he attempted to claim James Regani's body from the basement, planning to move it to a more remote location. While breaking through the concrete, neighbors heard the sounds and called police to report possible construction violations. When officers arrived to investigate the noise complaint, they discovered David in his basement, surrounded by concrete dust and the unmistakable stench of death. The excavation that followed revealed one of the most gruesome crime scenes in Indiana history. All three bodies were found wrapped in plastic and encased in concrete, preserved in various states of decomposition. David had used industrial-grade concrete and plastic sheeting, suggesting he had planned the burials carefully and intended them to be permanent. During interrogation, David showed no emotion as he confessed to the three murders. He described the killings in clinical detail, explaining his methods and motivations with the detachment of someone discussing the weather. When asked why he had targeted these specific boys, David simply said they were convenient and vulnerable. He expressed no remorse for the victims or their families, viewing the murders as necessary outlets for his rage. In November 2005, David pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again be released to kill. But David's story was far from over. In January 2006, just 2 months after his sentencing, David was found dead in his jail cell, hanging from a bedsheet he had torn into strips. Beside his body was a handwritten note confessing to 5 total murders and apologizing to the victims' families. The note revealed that David had killed 2 additional victims whose bodies were never found, taking their locations to his grave. David Moust's case represents one of the most catastrophic failures of the criminal justice system in modern American history. Despite clear warnings from mental health professionals, despite his own admissions that he would kill again, despite a pattern of escalating violence, he was repeatedly released to prey on innocent victims. His 20-year killing spree could have been prevented at multiple points, but bureaucratic failures, jurisdictional gaps, and systemic incompetence allowed a diagnosed psychopath to roam free. The families of his victims have never received adequate answers about how such a dangerous individual was allowed to slip through the cracks repeatedly. David's military records, his German conviction, his psychiatric evaluations, all of these should have created an unbreakable chain preventing his release. Instead, they became disconnected pieces of information that no single agency bothered to assemble into a complete picture. Our 4th killer operated on America's highways, turning the interstate system into his personal hunting ground. Larry William Eiler earned the terrifying nickname the Highway Killer by transforming rest stops, truck stops, and roadside areas into scenes of unimaginable horror. Between 1982 and 1984, he murdered at least 21 teenage boys and young men across the Midwest, though investigators believe the true number may be much higher. Larry was born on December 21, 1952, in Crawfordsville, Indiana, into a family that provided little stability or affection. His father was largely absent, working long hours and showing little interest in his son's development. His mother was emotionally distant, more concerned with maintaining appearances than addressing Larry's obvious behavioral problems. From an early age, Larry displayed disturbing tendencies. He tortured small animals, set fires, and showed an unhealthy fascination with violence and death. In school, Larry was intelligent but volatile. Teachers noted his ability to excel academically when he chose to apply himself, but also documented his explosive temper and inappropriate behavior toward other students. He was particularly drawn to younger, smaller children, often befriending them only to manipulate or intimidate them. By high school, Larry had developed a reputation as someone to avoid, a strange loner who made others uncomfortable with his intense stares and inappropriate comments. After graduation, Larry drifted between various jobs: construction work, factory labor, truck driving, never staying in one place long enough to form meaningful relationships or establish a stable life. This transient lifestyle would later prove crucial to his ability to evade law enforcement for so long. He could commit murders in one state, then disappear into another jurisdiction before investigators even realized a pattern existed. Larry's first known violent crime occurred in 1978 when he was 25 years old. He picked up a teenage hitchhiker outside Indianapolis, offering the boy a ride to Chicago. Instead of driving to Chicago, Larry took the teenager to a remote area where he attempted to sexually assault and stab him. The boy managed to escape, but not before Larry had bound his wrists and ankles with rope, a signature that would later help investigators connect Larry to multiple crime scenes. Incredibly, when police arrested Larry for this attack, he was charged only with minor assault and released with probation. The victim's account of being bound and tortured was dismissed as exaggeration, and Larry's clear escalation toward more serious violence was ignored. This early failure to recognize the severity of Larry's crimes would prove fatal for his future victims. For the next 4 years, Larry continued his pattern of picking up hitchhikers and young men from bars, but he became more careful about leaving witnesses. Investigators now believe he committed several murders during this period that were never connected to him, perfecting his techniques and learning to avoid detection. His victims were typically runaways, homeless youth, or gay men, people whose disappearances might not be immediately reported or thoroughly investigated. In 1982, Larry's killing spree began in earnest. His first confirmed victim was Stephen Agin, a 23-year-old man Larry picked up at a gay bar in Chicago. Larry lured Stephen to his apartment with promises of drugs and alcohol, then subjected him to hours of torture before finally strangling him. The murder was characterized by extreme sadism. Stephen had been bound, beaten, sexually assaulted, and stabbed multiple times before his death. Larry's methods became increasingly sophisticated and brutal. He would cruise highways and truck stops, looking for vulnerable targets, teenage hitchhikers, young men who appeared to be traveling alone, anyone who seemed desperate enough to accept a ride from a stranger. Once his victims were in his vehicle, Larry would drive them to remote locations where he could torture and kill them without interruption. The torture was always extensive and ritualistic. Larry would bind his victims with rope or wire, then subject them to hours of sexual assault and physical violence. He used knives to inflict dozens of small wounds, prolonging his victims' suffering as long as possible. Many victims showed signs of having been kept alive for days, tortured repeatedly until Larry finally grew bored and killed them. Larry's dumping grounds were carefully chosen for maximum concealment. He favored abandoned farmhouses, dense woods, and remote areas near highways where bodies might not be discovered for weeks or months. When they were found, the victims were often so decomposed that identification was difficult, further hampering police investigations. The interstate nature of Larry's crimes created a perfect storm for law enforcement confusion. Bodies were found in Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Kentucky, but different jurisdictions rarely communicated effectively. What appeared to be isolated murders in separate states were actually part of a coordinated killing spree by a single predator who understood how to exploit the gaps between law enforcement agencies. Larry's most horrific discovery came in October 1983 when 4 bodies were found at an abandoned farm in Lake Village, Indiana. The victims had been tortured extensively before being murdered and dumped in a shallow grave. All 4 showed signs of prolonged captivity and systematic torture. The crime scene was so disturbing that several investigators required psychological counseling afterward. It wasn't until 2019, through DNA analysis and genealogical research, that they were finally identified as 16-year-old Keith Lavelle Bibbs, 19-year-old Michael Bauer, John Bartlett, and John Brandenburg Jr. All were young men who had been reported missing from various locations across the Midwest, their families spending decades wondering what had happened to them. Larry's downfall began in 1984 when he made the mistake of operating too close to Chicago, where police had begun to notice patterns in the highway murders. Detective Sam McPherson of the Illinois State Police had been tracking the cases for months, noting similarities in the victims, the torture methods, and the dumping locations. When 16-year-old Daniel Bridges disappeared after being seen getting into a pickup truck matching Larry's vehicle description, police finally had a solid lead. Daniel's body was found in Rogers Park, showing the same pattern of binding, torture, and sexual assault that characterized Larry's other victims. This time, however, witnesses had seen Daniel getting into Larry's truck, and forensic evidence from the crime scene provided crucial DNA evidence. When police arrested Larry, they found rope and knives in his vehicle that matched evidence from multiple crime scenes. During interrogation, Larry initially denied all involvement in the murders. He claimed to be a long-haul trucker who simply happened to travel the same routes where bodies were being found. However, when confronted with physical evidence linking him to multiple crime scenes, Larry's composure began to crack. He eventually admitted to killing Daniel Bridges, but claimed it was self-defense during a sexual encounter gone wrong. Larry's trial for Daniel's murder began in 1984, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. In addition to witness testimony and physical evidence, prosecutors presented a timeline showing Larry's movements that corresponded perfectly with the discovery of bodies across multiple states. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding him guilty of first-degree murder. Larry was sentenced to death and sent to Illinois's death row, where he initially maintained his innocence in all other murders. However, as his execution date approached and his appeals were exhausted, Larry began to reconsider his strategy. In 1990, he contacted his attorney with an offer that would shock the law enforcement community. Larry offered to confess to 20 additional murders in exchange for having his death sentence commuted to life imprisonment without parole. He claimed to have detailed knowledge of unsolved cases across multiple states and promised to provide information that could bring closure to families who had been waiting years for answers about their missing loved ones. The negotiations were complex, involving prosecutors from multiple jurisdictions who had to agree to the deal. Some families of victims opposed any agreement that would spare Larry's life, while others desperately wanted the information he claimed to possess. Ultimately, Larry's execution was stayed while authorities evaluated his offer. Larry's confessions, when they finally came, were detailed and horrifying. He provided specific information about crime scenes that had never been made public, described personal items belonging to victims that had never been found, and led investigators to previously undiscovered dump sites. His knowledge of these cases left no doubt about his guilt. However, Larry's confessions also revealed the true scope of his crimes. He admitted to murders that had never been connected to the highway killer pattern, including several victims who had been found years earlier in different states. He described a killing spree that had lasted far longer than investigators realized and had claimed victims across a much wider geographic area. Larry never lived to see his death sentence commuted. On March 6, 1994, he died in his death row cell from complications related to AIDS, which he had contracted years earlier. His death came just weeks before authorities were expected to announce their decision on his plea agreement, taking with him any additional information about unsolved cases. Larry's attorney, Kathleen Zellner, later released his full confessions to help bring closure to victims' families. The documents revealed a predator who had operated with calculated precision, selecting victims based on their vulnerability and isolation. Larry had specifically targeted individuals whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed: runaways, hitchhikers, gay men in an era when police investigations of crimes against LGBTQ individuals were often inadequate. The highway killer case highlighted critical weaknesses in law enforcement coordination and communication. Larry was able to operate for years across multiple states because agencies didn't share information effectively. Murders in Indiana weren't connected to similar crimes in Illinois, and patterns that should have been obvious were missed because no single agency had access to all the data. Larry Eiler's reign of terror claimed at least 21 confirmed victims, but investigators believe the true number may be twice as high. His ability to exploit the interstate highway system and jurisdictional boundaries allowed him to kill for years while staying one step ahead of law enforcement. The final killer on our list is Lorenzo Gilliard, known as the Kansas City Strangler. Unlike the others we've discussed, Gilliard managed to hide in plain sight for over 15 years, living what appeared to be an ordinary life, while systematically hunting and killing women across Kansas City, Missouri. His story reveals how a predator can blend seamlessly into a community, earning trust and respect while harboring the darkest of secrets. Lorenzo Jerome Gilliard was born on May 24, 1950, in Kansas City, Missouri, into a family where violence wasn't just present, it was hereditary. His father was a convicted rapist. His brother would later be convicted of murder. His sister would also be convicted of murder. The Gilliard name became synonymous with brutality in Kansas City, but Lorenzo seemed different. He was charming, articulate, and held down steady jobs. For years, he worked as a trash company supervisor, a position that required trust and responsibility. Neighbors described him as helpful and friendly. He had relationships, paid his bills, and appeared to be just another working-class man trying to get by. But beneath this facade was a calculating predator who had been perfecting his methods since the 1970s. Gilliard's first known violent offense occurred in 1969 when he was arrested for assaulting and raping a young woman. The charges were mysteriously dropped after what police records describe as a reconciliation. In 1972, He was arrested again for raping and assaulting another woman who claimed he choked her until she lost consciousness. Again, the charges were dropped. This pattern of violence, followed by legal immunity, would define Gilliard's early years and embolden him to escalate. By 1977, Gilliard had moved beyond simple assault. He began killing. His victims were predominantly sex workers, women society often overlooked or dismissed. This wasn't accidental. Gilliard understood that these women's disappearances wouldn't generate the same urgency or resources as other victims. He was methodical in his selection, targeting women who worked the streets of Kansas City, women who were vulnerable and isolated. Gilliard's method was as consistent as it was brutal. He would approach his victims, often posing as a customer or someone offering help. Once he had them isolated, he would strangle them with whatever was available: nylon stockings, shoelaces, electrical wire, even their own clothing. But strangulation wasn't enough for Gilliard. He would stuff pieces of clothing or paper towels into their mouths, a signature that would later help investigators link his crimes. After killing them, he would remove their shoes, another bizarre ritual that became his calling card. The bodies were always dumped in secluded areas around Kansas City, often in wooded lots, abandoned buildings, or areas where they wouldn't be discovered quickly. Gilliard knew the city intimately. His job with the trash company gave him knowledge of routes, schedules, and locations where a body could remain hidden for weeks or months. He used this insider knowledge to stay ahead of investigators. Between 1977 and 1993, at least 13 women fell victim to Gilliard's reign of terror. There was Stacy Swafford, just 19 years old, found strangled in 1977. Gwendolyn Keyzine, 25, discovered in 1980 with paper towels stuffed in her mouth. Catherine Barry, 34, found in 1986 with her shoelaces used as the murder weapon. Each killing followed the same pattern, each victim bearing the same signature marks that would eventually become Gilliard's downfall. What made Gilliard particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize. During the day, he was Lorenzo the supervisor, respected by his employees and known for his work ethic. He attended family gatherings, maintained friendships, and even had romantic relationships. Women who knew him described him as charming and attentive, but at night he transformed into something else entirely: a predator stalking the streets of Kansas City. The investigation into what police called the Kansas City Strangler murders stretched across decades. Multiple task forces were formed and disbanded. Hundreds of suspects were questioned and released. The crimes seemed random, the killer a ghost who struck without pattern or warning. But investigators noticed the similarities: the strangulation, the items stuffed in mouths, the missing shoes, the dumping locations. They knew they were dealing with a serial killer, but identifying him proved nearly impossible. The breakthrough came in 1987, when Gilliard became a suspect in the murder of 36-year-old Sheila Ingold. Police brought him in for questioning and took a blood sample, but without enough evidence to hold him, they were forced to let him go. That blood sample sat in evidence storage for years, a piece of biological evidence waiting for technology to catch up with justice. By the early 2000s, DNA technology had advanced significantly. Cold case units across the country were revisiting unsolved murders, running old evidence through new databases. In 2004, 17 years after that blood sample was taken, forensic technicians ran Gilliard's DNA through the national database. The results were devastating for Gilliard and vindicating for investigators. His DNA matched evidence from multiple crime scenes, linking him definitively to at least 6 murders. On April 12, 2004, Lorenzo Gilliard was arrested at his home in Kansas City. Neighbors watched in shock as the man they'd known for years was led away in handcuffs. The friendly supervisor, the helpful neighbor, the charming companion was revealed to be one of Kansas City's most prolific serial killers. During his interrogation, Gilliard maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming DNA evidence. He claimed the sex was consensual, that he had nothing to do with the murders. But the evidence told a different story. DNA doesn't lie, and it placed Gilliard at multiple crime scenes during the time of death. The trial began in 2007, and prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence linking Gilliard to the murders. The DNA matches were irrefutable. Crime scene analysis showed patterns that could only be explained by a single killer. Victim after victim, the evidence painted a picture of a man who had spent decades hunting women with methodical precision. Gilliard's defense team faced an impossible task. The DNA evidence was overwhelming, the pattern of crimes undeniable. In a strategic decision to avoid the death penalty, they agreed to a bench trial, allowing the judge rather than a jury to determine guilt. On March 16, 2007, Judge John O'Malley found Lorenzo Gilliard guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, Lorenzo Gilliard sits in the Crossroads Correctional Center in Cameron, Missouri, where he will remain until he dies. He's now in his 70s, an aging man whose decades of freedom allowed him to destroy at least 13 lives and devastate countless families. He continues to maintain his innocence, a final insult to his victims and their loved ones. But Gilliard's story raises disturbing questions that extend far beyond his individual crimes. How many other Lorenzo Gilliards are out there, hiding behind masks of normalcy while committing unspeakable acts? How many serial killers move through our communities undetected, their crimes attributed to random violence or simply overlooked entirely? The 5 killers we've examined today, Donald Harvey, Darren Dion Van, David Moust, Larry Eiler, and Lorenzo Gilliard, represent a terrifying truth about the nature of evil. They weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were men who walked among us, who held jobs, maintained relationships, and appeared utterly ordinary. They exploited our trust, our systems, and our assumptions about what evil looks like. These cases remind us that the most dangerous predators aren't always the ones who stand out. They're often the ones who blend in, who understand how to manipulate social expectations and institutional weaknesses to continue their crimes undetected. They target the vulnerable, the overlooked, the forgotten, knowing that society's indifference provides them with cover. The victims of these 5 killers deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in criminal cases, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by calculated evil. What makes these killers particularly chilling isn't just their brutality, but how they manipulated the very systems designed to protect us. Each one exploited a different vulnerability in society, turning places of healing, trust, and safety into hunting grounds for their twisted desires. The psychological profiles of these men reveal disturbing patterns that law enforcement and mental health professionals continue to study today. Donald Harvey's case exposed critical flaws in hospital oversight systems that allowed him to kill for nearly 2 decades. His ability to move between medical facilities, leaving death in his wake, highlighted how institutional failures can enable predators to operate with impunity. Harvey's own words during interviews revealed a man who viewed himself as having godlike power over life and death, a delusion that he fed with each murder. What's particularly disturbing about Harvey's case is how he weaponized compassion itself. Families trusted him with their most vulnerable loved ones, believing he was providing care and comfort in their final moments. Instead, he was accelerating their deaths for his own psychological gratification. The betrayal of this sacred trust makes his crimes especially heinous, and his eventual violent death in prison seemed to many like a form of cosmic justice. Darren Dion Vaughn's story illustrates how societal indifference toward certain populations can enable serial killers to operate longer than they should. His victims were predominantly sex workers, women who society often views as disposable or whose disappearances don't generate the same level of concern as other missing persons. This allowed Van to kill repeatedly while moving between states, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement. Van's military background and his systematic approach to murder reveal a calculating mind that planned his crimes with military precision. His confession to police was delivered with an eerie calm that suggested he viewed his victims as little more than obstacles to be eliminated. The fact that he claimed to have killed dozens more women across multiple states suggests that his confirmed 7 victims may only represent a fraction of his true body count. The case of David Moust represents one of the most glaring examples of systemic failure in the criminal justice system. Despite multiple psychiatric evaluations that clearly identified him as a high-risk individual with homicidal tendencies, he was repeatedly released back into society. His own requests not to be paroled were ignored, and each release resulted in more innocent victims. Moust's childhood trauma and institutionalization created a perfect storm of psychological damage that manifested in his compulsion to kill. His targeting of young males, often around the same age he was when he experienced his own trauma, suggests his murders were attempts to regain control over powerlessness he felt as a child. The concrete encasement of his victims' bodies reveals a desire not just to kill, but to permanently possess and control his victims, even in death. Larry Eiler's ability to evade capture for so long demonstrates how jurisdictional boundaries can become barriers to effective law enforcement. His use of the interstate highway system allowed him to spread his crimes across multiple states, making it difficult for individual police departments to recognize the pattern of his killings. This case highlighted the need for better communication and coordination between law enforcement agencies across state lines. Eiler's victims were often young men from marginalized communities, hitchhikers, and male sex workers whose disappearances didn't initially trigger intensive investigations. His method of operation, picking up victims along highways and disposing of their bodies in remote locations, made him a ghost that law enforcement struggled to track. The extreme violence of his crimes, involving torture and mutilation, suggests a level of sadistic pleasure that went far beyond simply killing. Lorenzo Gilliard's case demonstrates how some serial killers can maintain a facade of normalcy while carrying out horrific crimes over extended periods. His ability to hold down a steady job, maintain relationships, and appear as a functioning member of society allowed him to avoid suspicion for decades. This Jekyll and Hyde existence is particularly disturbing because it shows how predators can live among us completely undetected. Gilliard's targeting of sex workers follows a pattern seen in many serial killers who choose victims from vulnerable populations. These women often lived on the margins of society, making their disappearances less likely to trigger immediate intensive investigations. His method of strangulation suggests an intimate, hands on approach to killing that indicates he derived psychological satisfaction from the act of taking life. The DNA evidence that finally brought Gilliard to justice represents a triumph of forensic science over time. The blood sample taken in 1987 sat in evidence storage for nearly 2 decades before technology advanced enough to make the connections that solved multiple cold cases. This highlights how advances in forensic science can provide justice for victims and their families even years after the crimes were committed. What unites all these killers is their ability to exploit trust and vulnerability. Harvey exploited the trust patients and families place in healthcare workers. Vaughn exploited the desperation of vulnerable women. Maust exploited the innocence of children and teenagers. Eiler exploited the vulnerability of young men seeking transportation or companionship. Gilliard exploited the marginalized status of sex workers. Their stories serve as stark reminders that evil often wears a familiar face and operates within systems we trust. The hospital orderly, the quiet neighbor, the helpful stranger offering a ride, the seemingly normal coworker. These killers remind us that predators often hide in plain sight, using our own assumptions about safety and normalcy against us. The psychological aftermath of their crimes extends far beyond their immediate victims. Families destroyed by loss, communities shattered by betrayal of trust, and institutions forced to confront their own failures in protecting the vulnerable. The ripple effects of their actions continue to influence how we think about safety, trust, and the systems designed to protect us. These cases also highlight the importance of listening to victims, taking missing person reports seriously regardless of the victim's social status, and maintaining robust oversight of institutions that serve vulnerable populations. The lessons learned from these tragedies have led to improvements in everything from hospital security protocols to multi-jurisdictional law enforcement cooperation. As we remember these killers, we must also remember their victims, not as statistics or case files, but as human beings whose lives were cut short by evil. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal disturbing patterns that extend far beyond their individual crimes. What makes these cases particularly chilling is how they exploited the very systems designed to protect society's most vulnerable members. Each killer operated within a specific ecosystem of trust and vulnerability, turning these environments into hunting grounds. Donald Harvey's case exposes the terrifying reality of healthcare serial killers. For 17 years, he moved between hospitals and nursing homes, wielding the tools of healing as weapons of death. His victims trusted him with their lives, never suspecting that the man administering their medication or adjusting their oxygen was actually orchestrating their demise. Harvey's methods were sophisticated and varied. He injected cyanide into IV lines, mixed arsenic into food, smothered patients with pillows, and tampered with life support equipment. What made him particularly dangerous was his medical knowledge and access to controlled substances that could kill without immediate detection. The institutional failures in Harvey's case are staggering. Despite working at multiple facilities where unusual death rates occurred, no comprehensive investigation was launched until 1987. Hospital administrators either failed to notice the patterns or chose to ignore them. When Harvey left one facility, he simply moved to another, carrying his deadly skills with him. The culture of medical institutions, where death is unfortunately common, provided perfect cover for his activities. Families grieving for elderly or terminally ill relatives rarely questioned natural-seeming deaths, especially when they occurred in medical settings under professional care. Harvey's psychological makeup reveals a man who thrived on the ultimate form of control. In interviews, he described playing God, deciding who lived and who died based on his own twisted criteria. Some victims he claimed were mercy killings, ending suffering for terminal patients. Others he admitted killing out of convenience or annoyance. One victim died simply because she had complained about her food. Another died because Harvey was running late and didn't want to deal with their care requirements. This casual approach to murder demonstrates a complete absence of empathy and a narcissistic belief in his right to determine others' fates. The investigation that finally brought Harvey down began with Dr. Lee Lehman, a pathologist who detected the distinct smell of cyanide during an autopsy. This single observation unraveled decades of hidden murders. When confronted, Harvey didn't deny his crimes. Instead, he seemed almost relieved to finally discuss his activities openly. His detailed confessions revealed the scope of his killing spree and the methodical nature of his approach. He kept mental records of his victims, remembering specific details about their deaths years later. Harvey's time in prison was marked by the same calculated behavior that characterized his killing spree. He maintained his innocence publicly, while privately acknowledging his crimes to fellow inmates and prison staff. His death in 2017, beaten by another inmate, brought a violent end to a life defined by violence. The irony that wasn't lost on observers that a man who had killed so many vulnerable people died helplessly at the hands of someone stronger. Darren Dion Van represents a different but equally terrifying type of predator. Where Harvey operated within institutional settings, Van exploited the vulnerabilities of women living on society's margins. His victims were sex workers, many struggling with addiction and homelessness, women whose disappearances often went unnoticed or uninvestigated with the same urgency as other missing persons cases. Vaughn's criminal evolution shows a pattern of escalating violence that the justice system failed to interrupt. His military service ended in disgrace with an other than honorable discharge. His domestic violence conviction in Indiana resulted in only 90 days in jail, a sentence that barely addressed the underlying issues driving his behavior. Most significantly, his sexual assault conviction in Texas in 2009 should have resulted in a much longer sentence, but plea negotiations and jurisdictional oversights allowed him to serve only 5 years. The investigation into Van's crimes revealed the interstate nature of his activities. He traveled extensively, using his mobility to avoid detection and expand his hunting grounds. His confessions suggest victims in multiple states, indicating a killing spree that may have been far more extensive than the 7 confirmed murders. The transient nature of his victims and his own lifestyle created perfect conditions for serial murder. Sex workers often work alone, meet clients in isolated locations, and their disappearances may not be immediately reported to authorities. Van's methods were brutal but consistent. He strangled his victims, often during or after sexual encounters. The bodies he led police to in Gary, Indiana, were found in abandoned buildings, locations that reflected the urban decay and neglect that characterized much of the city. These dump sites weren't random. Van chose locations where bodies might remain undiscovered for extended periods, buying him time to continue killing and evade capture. The psychological profile that emerges from Van's case is that of a man consumed by rage, particularly toward women. His ex-wife described him as increasingly unstable, given to mumbling to himself and exhibiting paranoid behaviors. The end of his marriage seemed to trigger an escalation in his criminal activities. Like many serial killers, Van appeared to use murder as a way to exert control and express his anger toward the world that he felt had wronged him. David Moust's case represents perhaps the most tragic failure of the criminal justice and mental health systems. From childhood, every interaction with authorities revealed a deeply disturbed individual who posed a continuing threat to society. His mother had him institutionalized at age 9 after he allegedly tried to drown his brother and set fire to his bed. Mental health professionals consistently diagnosed him as unstable and at high risk for violence. Yet the system repeatedly released him, often against professional recommendations and sometimes against his own requests to remain incarcerated. Moust's military service in Germany began his documented killing career. The murder of 13-year-old James McClister in 1974 should have been a clear indicator of his potential for extreme violence. Instead, he served only 4 years for what was classified as involuntary manslaughter, a sentence that seemed inadequate given the circumstances. His own request not to be paroled suggests he recognized his inability to control his violent impulses, a self-awareness that makes his repeated releases even more inexcusable. The pattern continued throughout Moust's life. Each crime revealed escalating violence and consistent targeting of vulnerable young males. His methods became increasingly brutal, involving not just murder, but torture, dismemberment, and elaborate disposal techniques. The bodies found in his basement were encased in concrete, indicating premeditation and a systematic approach to concealing evidence. What makes Moust's case particularly disturbing is the institutional knowledge of his dangerousness. Cook County psychiatrists explicitly warned that he was a high homicidal risk with pathological preoccupations with death and mutilation. These weren't vague concerns, but specific warnings about his potential for extreme violence. Yet bureaucratic processes and overcrowded prison systems led to his release, with predictably tragic results. The victims Moust claimed after his final release were children and teenagers who had no way to protect themselves from his predatory behavior. 13-year-old Michael Dennis, 16-year-old James Regani, and 19-year-old Nick James were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when they encountered a predator who should never have been free to harm them. Their deaths represent not just individual tragedies, but systemic failures that allowed a known dangerous individual to continue killing. Larry Eiler's reign of terror as the highway killer demonstrates how geographic mobility can enable serial murder on a massive scale. The interstate highway system that connected American communities also provided Eiler with hunting grounds that spanned multiple states and jurisdictions. This mobility created investigative challenges that allowed him to kill for years before being apprehended. Eiler's victims were primarily young men and teenage boys, often hitchhikers or individuals he encountered at gay bars. The 1980s were a time when LGBTQ individuals faced significant discrimination and violence, factors that may have contributed to delayed or inadequate investigations into their disappearances and deaths. Many of Eiler's victims were living on the margins, making them ideal targets for a predator who understood that their cases might not receive full investigative attention. The brutality of Eiler's crimes set him apart, even among serial killers. His attacks involved extreme violence, sexual assault, torture, and often dismemberment or evisceration. These weren't quick killings, but prolonged acts of sadistic violence that suggest deep psychological disturbance and a need to inflict maximum suffering on his victims. The physical evidence found at crime scenes painted a picture of a killer who derived satisfaction from his victims' pain and terror. Eiler's early criminal behavior provided clear warning signs that went unheeded. His 1978 arrest for attempting to sexually assault and stab a teenage hitchhiker should have resulted in serious consequences and intensive monitoring. Instead, he received minimal punishment and was free to escalate his criminal behavior. This pattern of inadequate response to violent crime created conditions that allowed Eiler to develop into one of the Midwest's most prolific serial killers. The investigation into Eiler's crimes was complicated by jurisdictional issues and the transient nature of both the killer and his victims. Bodies were found across multiple states, requiring coordination between law enforcement agencies that often had different priorities and resources. Some victims remained unidentified for decades, only recently being named through DNA analysis and forensic genealogy efforts. Lorenzo Gilliard's case illustrates how serial killers can hide in plain sight within their communities for decades. As a trash company supervisor in Kansas City, Gilliard appeared to be a productive member of society. He held steady employment, had relationships, and maintained a facade of normalcy that concealed his double life as a serial killer targeting vulnerable women. Gilliard's victims were predominantly sex workers, women whose disappearances often didn't generate the same level of public attention or investigative resources as other murder cases. This targeting wasn't accidental. Gilliard understood that these women worked in dangerous conditions, often alone and in isolated locations, making them ideal victims for someone seeking to avoid detection. Their lifestyle and work environment provided ready explanations for their disappearances that didn't immediately point to serial murder. The span of Gilliard's killing career from 1977 to 1993 demonstrates the challenges of identifying serial murder patterns, particularly when victims come from marginalized communities. Individual murders were investigated as separate incidents rather than connected crimes. Without modern DNA analysis and database systems, the links between cases remained hidden for years. Gilliard's family background reveals a pattern of violence and criminal behavior that may have contributed to his development as a killer. His father was a convicted rapist, and his siblings also had serious criminal records, including murder convictions. This family history suggests environmental factors that may have influenced Gilliard's psychological development and normalized violence in his worldview. The breakthrough in Gilliard's case came through advances in forensic science, specifically DNA analysis of evidence collected years earlier. The blood sample taken during the 1987 investigation into Sheila Ingold's murder provided the crucial link that connected him to multiple crime scenes. This technological advancement allowed investigators to finally establish the connections between murders that had gone unsolved for decades. These 5 cases share common elements that illuminate the broader phenomenon of serial murder in America. Each killer exploited institutional or social vulnerabilities, targeting individuals who were less likely to be missed or whose deaths might not be thoroughly investigated. They operated within systems that provided cover for their activities, whether hospitals, highways, or urban environments where violence was unfortunately common. The institutional failures revealed in these cases highlight the need for better communication between agencies, more thorough background checks, and improved monitoring of individuals with histories of violence. Harvey's ability to move between medical facilities, Moust's repeated releases despite professional warnings, and Van's light sentences for serious crimes all represent systemic breakdowns that enabled continued killing. The victims in these cases represent hundreds of lives cut short by preventable violence. They were patients seeking healing, women trying to survive in difficult circumstances, young men and boys with their whole lives ahead of them. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal disturbing patterns that extend far beyond their individual crimes. What makes them particularly terrifying is how they exploited the very systems designed to protect us, turning trust into vulnerability and compassion into weakness. Donald Harvey represents perhaps the most insidious type of predator, one who operates within institutions we depend on for healing. For 17 years, this so-called angel of death moved through hospitals like a shadow, methodically ending lives while wearing the mask of a caregiver. His victims trusted him completely. They were at their most vulnerable, lying in hospital beds, dependent on his care for their very survival. Harvey didn't just betray that trust, he weaponized it. What's most chilling about Harvey's methodology was its calculated precision. He didn't kill in moments of rage or passion. Instead, he carefully selected his weapons. Arsenic slipped into food, cyanide injected into IV lines, pillows pressed over faces when patients were too weak to resist. Each murder was deliberate, planned, executed with the cold efficiency of someone who had perfected his craft through repetition. The scope of Harvey's crimes defies comprehension. 87 victims by his own admission, though only 37 could be officially confirmed. Think about that number for a moment. 87 people who went to the hospital seeking healing, only to encounter a predator masquerading as their protector. 87 families who said goodbye to loved ones, never knowing they were placing them directly into the hands of death itself. Harvey's ability to evade detection for so long exposes critical flaws in our healthcare system. Deaths in hospitals are expected, routine even. When elderly or critically ill patients pass away, few questions are asked. Harvey understood this perfectly and exploited it with ruthless efficiency. He later admitted to investigators that he enjoyed playing God, deciding who lived and who died based on nothing more than his own twisted desires. The psychology behind Harvey's crimes reveals a man driven by an insatiable need for control. He claimed some victims were mercy killings, but prosecutors saw through this facade. The truth was far more sinister. Harvey killed because he could, because it gave him a rush of power that nothing else could match. In his own words, while some patients might have lived a few more hours or days, they were all going to die anyway. This chilling rationalization allowed him to justify 17 years of systematic murder. Darren Dion Van represents a different but equally terrifying archetype, the mobile predator who understood how to exploit jurisdictional gaps and societal blind spots. Van's hunting ground stretched across multiple states, from Indiana to Illinois, California to North Carolina. This geographic spread wasn't accidental, it was strategic. By constantly moving, by never staying in one place long enough to establish a clear pattern, Van made it exponentially harder for law enforcement to connect his crimes. His victims were primarily sex workers, women who existed on society's margins, whose disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated with the same urgency as other missing persons cases. Van understood this cruel reality and exploited it mercilessly. These women were vulnerable not just physically, but systemically, failed by the very society that should have protected them. The method behind Van's madness was disturbingly methodical. He would connect with victims through escort websites or street encounters, lure them to secluded locations, then strangle them with his bare hands. There was an intimacy to his violence that made it even more horrifying. This wasn't killing from a distance. It was personal, direct, requiring him to look into his victims' eyes as the life drained from them. What makes Van's case particularly infuriating is how many opportunities the system had to stop him. His military discharge for behavioral issues, his 2004 arrest for threatening a girlfriend with gasoline and a lighter, his 2009 sexual assault conviction in Texas, all were red flags that should have triggered closer scrutiny. Instead, he was repeatedly released, given chance after chance to continue his deadly spree. The Texas conviction is especially galling. Van served only 5 years for sexual assault, partly because prosecutors weren't aware of his Indiana conviction when they offered a plea deal. This communication failure between jurisdictions quite literally had deadly consequences. Had Texas prosecutors known his full criminal history, Van might have received a much longer sentence, potentially preventing the murders that followed his 2013 release. David Moust's story reads like a blueprint for how the mental health and criminal justice systems can fail catastrophically. From childhood, every warning sign was there. A mother who claimed he tried to drown his younger brother and set fire to his bed. Confinement in a mental institution at age 9. Sexual abuse at a children's home. These weren't just red flags. They were screaming sirens that went unheeded. His first murder in Germany should have been the end of his story. Army was a clear indication of his dangerous nature, yet he served only 4 years for what was essentially the calculated murder of a child. Even more disturbing, Moust himself requested not to be paroled, somehow understanding that his release would lead to more violence. The system ignored his own warnings about his dangerous nature. The psychological evaluations performed during his incarceration were crystal clear in their assessment. Cook County psychiatrists noted his pathological preoccupation with death, mutilation, and bizarre ideations. They deemed him unstable and a high suicidal and homicidal risk. These weren't subtle hints, they were explicit warnings that Moust posed a clear and present danger to society. Yet he was still released, still given the opportunity to kill again. The discovery of bodies encased in concrete in Moust's basement represents perhaps the most horrifying aspect of his crimes. This wasn't just murder, it was the complete obliteration of his victims' humanity. By encasing them in concrete, Moust wasn't just hiding evidence, he was creating monuments to his own power, permanent testaments to his ability to make people disappear completely. Larry Eyler earned his nickname the Highway Killer through a reign of terror that turned America's interstate system into his personal hunting ground. The highways that connect our communities, that represent freedom and mobility in American culture, became corridors of death under Eyler's predatory gaze. His victims were often hitchhikers, young men seeking adventure, or simply trying to get from one place to another, only to encounter a monster behind the wheel. Eyler's crimes were characterized by extreme, sadistic violence that went far beyond simple murder. He would restrain his victims, subject them to torture and sexual assault, then kill them through brutal stabbings, often followed by dismemberment. The level of violence suggested someone who derived sexual pleasure from inflicting pain and terror, someone for whom the act of killing itself wasn't enough. It had to be prolonged, agonizing, complete. The geographic scope of Eyler's crimes created a jurisdictional nightmare for law enforcement. Bodies found in Indiana, Illinois, and other Midwest states were initially treated as separate cases by different departments. This fragmentation allowed Eyler to continue killing for years before investigators began connecting the dots. His mobility wasn't just a practical advantage, it was a deliberate strategy to avoid detection. Perhaps most frustrating about Eyler's case is how close authorities came to stopping him earlier. His 1978 arrest for attempting to sexually assault and stab a teenage hitchhiker should have been a clear warning. The bound wrists and ankles of that victim matched exactly the patterns later seen in the highway murderer cases. Yet Eyler received only a minor penalty and was released to kill again. Lorenzo Gilliard represents the most insidious type of predator, one who hides in plain sight, operating within his own community for decades, while maintaining the facade of a normal, even helpful citizen. As a trash company supervisor in Kansas City, Gilliard had legitimate reasons to be in different neighborhoods, to know the layout of the city, to understand which areas were secluded enough for body disposal. His victim selection reveals a calculated understanding of societal blind spots. By primarily targeting sex workers, Gilliard chose victims whose disappearances were less likely to trigger intensive investigations, whose deaths were less likely to generate sustained media attention or community outrage. This wasn't coincidental. It was strategic targeting of society's most vulnerable members. The 17-year span of Gilliard's killing spree from 1977 to 1993 represents an almost incomprehensible, sustained campaign of violence. 17 years of women disappearing from Kansas City streets, 17 years of bodies being found, strangled, and discarded, 17 years of a predator walking freely among the very community he was terrorizing. What makes Gilliard's case particularly significant is how it was ultimately solved through advances in forensic science. The blood sample taken in 1987 during the Sheila Ingold investigation lay dormant for years until DNA technology advanced enough to make meaningful comparisons. When that sample was finally run through the national database in 2004, it connected Gilliard to multiple unsolved murders spanning decades. The common threads connecting all five of these killers reveal systemic vulnerabilities that extend far beyond individual cases. Each exploited different aspects of societal trust and institutional failure. Harvey used our faith in healthcare systems. Van exploited jurisdictional gaps and societal indifference to marginalized victims. Maust benefited from repeated failures of the mental health and criminal justice systems. Eiler took advantage of interstate mobility and communication barriers between law enforcement agencies. Gilliard relied on community trust and the investigative limitations of pre-DNA forensic science. These cases collectively represent thousands of victims whose lives were cut short by predators who understood how to exploit the very systems designed to protect us. They remind us that evil often wears ordinary faces, works ordinary jobs, lives in ordinary neighborhoods. As we delve deeper into the twisted mind of Lorenzo Gilliard, what emerges is perhaps the most chilling aspect of his story: the systematic failure of a justice system that had multiple opportunities to stop him before his killing spree began. Lorenzo Jerome Gilliard Jr. was born into violence on May 24, 1950, in Kansas City, Missouri. His father was a convicted rapist. His brother would later be convicted of murder. His sister would also become a killer. Violence wasn't just in his environment, it was in his blood, passed down like a genetic curse that would claim 13 innocent lives. From childhood, Lorenzo displayed the warning signs that criminologists now recognize as harbingers of serial violence. He was a bully who targeted smaller, weaker children. He tortured animals for pleasure. By his teens, he had dropped out of school and was already accumulating a rap sheet that should have marked him as a dangerous predator. But time and again, the system failed. In 1969, at just 19 years old, Lorenzo was arrested for brutally assaulting and raping a young woman. The charges were dropped when the victim, likely intimidated or coerced, agreed to a reconciliation. 3 years later, in 1972, he struck again. Another woman, another rape, another strangulation that left her unconscious and gasping for life. Again, the charges mysteriously vanished. This pattern of violence, followed by legal leniency, would define Lorenzo's early criminal career. He learned that he could hurt women, that he could dominate and terrorize them, and that the consequences would be minimal. Each dropped charge, each plea bargain, each early release was another green light for escalation. By the mid-1970s, Lorenzo had settled into what appeared to be a normal life. He worked as a trash company supervisor, a job that gave him intimate knowledge of Kansas City's back alleys, dumpsters, and abandoned lots. He knew exactly where bodies could be disposed of without detection. He understood the rhythms of the city, when areas would be deserted, when he could work without witnesses. His first confirmed murder occurred in 1977, though investigators believe he may have killed earlier victims whose bodies were never found. The victim was a young prostitute, found strangled with her own clothing, her body dumped in an overgrown lot like discarded trash. The method was efficient, personal, and would become Lorenzo's signature. Over the next 16 years, this pattern would repeat with terrifying regularity. Lorenzo prowled the streets of Kansas City, hunting women who society had largely forgotten: prostitutes, drug addicts, runaways, women whose disappearances wouldn't trigger massive search efforts or media attention. He understood that these women were invisible to most of society, making them perfect victims for his twisted appetites. His hunting ground was primarily the area around Troost Avenue, a notorious strip where prostitution and drug dealing flourished under the cover of urban decay. Lorenzo would cruise slowly in his vehicle, studying potential victims like a predator evaluating prey. He looked for women who were alone, vulnerable, desperate. Sometimes he posed as a customer. Other times, he offered rides to women walking the dangerous streets late at night. Once they were in his vehicle, they were trapped. The murders themselves were acts of profound brutality disguised as sexual encounters. Lorenzo would strangle his victims with whatever was available: nylon stockings, electrical cords, shoelaces, even their own clothing. But death wasn't enough for him. He would stuff paper towels, cloths, or other materials into their mouths, a final act of domination and silencing. Then came the disposal. Lorenzo would strip his victims of their shoes, a ritual whose significance remains unclear but was consistent across multiple crime scenes. Their bodies would be dumped in secluded areas around Kansas City: vacant lots, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, places where they might not be discovered for days or weeks, allowing decomposition to destroy crucial evidence. What made Lorenzo particularly dangerous was his ability to blend into normal society between murders. To his coworkers, he was just another blue-collar supervisor doing his job. To his neighbors, he was quiet and unremarkable. He maintained relationships, held steady employment, and showed no outward signs of the monster that lurked beneath. This facade of normalcy allowed him to continue killing for over a decade without serious suspicion falling upon him. The investigation into what would become known as the Kansas City Strangler murders was hampered by the very factors that made Lorenzo's victims attractive to him in the first place. Because many of the women were involved in prostitution or drug use, their deaths didn't receive the same level of attention or resources that other murders might have warranted. Witnesses were reluctant to come forward. Family members often had complicated relationships with the victims. The cases grew cold, files gathering dust while Lorenzo continued to hunt. The breakthrough that would finally bring Lorenzo to justice came in 1987, though it would take nearly 2 decades to bear fruit. Sheila Ingold, a 36-year-old woman, was found murdered in a manner consistent with the other Kansas City Strangler victims. Lorenzo had somehow become a person of interest in this case, and police managed to obtain a blood sample from him. However, DNA technology was still in its infancy, and there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. He was released, and the blood sample was filed away, waiting for science to catch up with justice. During the 1990s, as DNA analysis became more sophisticated and databases began connecting crimes across jurisdictions, cold case units started revisiting unsolved murders with new tools and fresh eyes. In 2004, 17 years after that blood sample was taken, forensic analysts ran Lorenzo's DNA through the national database. The results were devastating and conclusive. His genetic material matched evidence from multiple crime scenes spanning nearly 2 decades of murder. On April 12, 2004, Lorenzo Gilliard was arrested at his home in Kansas City. He was now 53 years old, a grandfather who had spent decades hiding in plain sight. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community and brought a mix of relief and anguish to the families of his victims. Finally, after years of wondering who had killed their daughters, sisters, and mothers, they had a name and a face. The evidence against Lorenzo was overwhelming. DNA connected him to victim after victim. His work routes and personal movements aligned with the locations where bodies were discovered. Most damning of all, investigators found that he had kept detailed records and maps that corresponded to dump sites and hunting grounds. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated, methodical murder carried out over decades. In a strategic move to avoid the death penalty, Lorenzo's defense team agreed to a bench trial, meaning his fate would be decided by a judge rather than a jury. The prosecution, in exchange, agreed not to seek capital punishment. The trial laid bare the full scope of Lorenzo's crimes. Victim after victim was remembered not just as a statistic, but as someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone whose life had value and meaning beyond the circumstances that made them vulnerable. On March 16, 2007, Lorenzo Gilliard was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same cold detachment that had allowed him to kill 13 women and then return to his normal life as if nothing had happened. Today, Lorenzo Gilliard sits in the Crossroads Correctional Centers in Cameron, Missouri, where he will remain until he dies. He has never expressed remorse for his crimes, never acknowledged the pain he caused to families and communities. At 73 years old, he represents a chilling reminder that evil can wear the most ordinary face, can live next door, can work alongside us, all while harboring the darkest of secrets. The case of Lorenzo Gilliard forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society values different lives. His victims were marginalized women whose disappearances didn't trigger the same level of concern or investigation that other murders might have received. These 5 killers represent more than just individual acts of evil. They expose the fragile threads that hold our society together and reveal how easily those threads can snap when we look away from the vulnerable, the forgotten, and the marginalized. Donald Harvey exploited the most sacred trust we place in healthcare workers. For 17 years, he moved through hospitals like a shadow of death, poisoning patients who believed they were in safe hands. His victims trusted him with their lives, and he repaid that trust with calculated murder. Harvey's case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about institutional oversight. How many warning signs were missed? How many small red flags were dismissed as coincidence? The answer is chilling because it suggests that Harvey wasn't just a lone wolf operating in darkness. He was enabled by a system that failed to see patterns, failed to ask hard questions, and failed to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Darren Dion Van's victims were predominantly sex workers. Women's society had already written off as disposable. This isn't coincidence, it's strategy. Van understood that these women's disappearances wouldn't trigger massive manhunts or round-the-clock news coverage. He knew that their deaths would be investigated with less urgency, their cases would receive fewer resources, and their stories would be buried in the back pages of newspapers if they were covered at all. Van's confession to killing dozens across multiple states reveals the terrifying mobility of modern predators and the deadly gaps in communication between law enforcement agencies. Every time he crossed state lines, he essentially reset the clock on suspicion. David Moust's story is perhaps the most infuriating because it represents the ultimate failure of the justice system. Mental health professionals repeatedly warned that he was dangerous. Prison psychiatrists documented his obsession with death and mutilation. They literally wrote in official reports that he was a high homicidal risk. Yet he was released again and again. Moust himself begged not to be paroled because he knew what he was capable of. The system ignored his own desperate plea for continued confinement. 3 more children died because bureaucrats prioritized rehabilitation over public safety, even when faced with overwhelming evidence that rehabilitation had failed. Larry Ayler turned America's highway system into his personal hunting ground. The interstate highway system, designed to connect our nation and fuel economic growth, became a corridor of death in his hands. Ayler understood that mobility was his greatest weapon. By the time bodies were discovered in one state, he was already hunting in another. Jurisdictional boundaries that were meant to organize law enforcement became barriers that protected him. His victims were often hitchhikers and young men who trusted a stranger offering a ride. That basic human interaction, helping someone get from one place to another, became a death sentence. Lorenzo Gilliard operated for 16 years in plain sight. He had a regular job, lived in the community, and maintained relationships. His neighbors saw him as just another guy trying to make a living. This ordinariness was his camouflage. While police were looking for monsters, Gilliard was picking up his paycheck, attending family gatherings, and blending into the fabric of Kansas City life. His case demonstrates how DNA technology revolutionized criminal investigations. Without that 1987 blood sample sitting in evidence storage, Gilliard might never have been caught. How many other samples are sitting in evidence rooms right now, waiting for technology to connect them to unsolved cases? These killers succeeded because they understood something fundamental about human nature and social structures. They knew that society has blind spots, groups of people we don't pay attention to, systems that don't communicate with each other, and institutions that prioritize efficiency over vigilance. They weaponized our compassion, our trust, and our indifference. The true horror isn't just in the individual acts of violence. It's in recognizing how these killers were able to operate for so long, claiming so many victims, while the rest of us went about our daily lives completely unaware. They walked among us, served us food, worked in our hospitals, drove our streets, and we never knew. That's the most terrifying realization of all. Evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it clocks in for the night shift, offers you a ride, or simply smiles and asks if you need help. These cases remind us that vigilance isn't paranoia, that asking questions isn't being difficult, and that protecting the vulnerable isn't someone else's job. It's all of ours. Because the next time you hear about a serial killer who operated for years without detection, remember these 5 names and ask yourself, what are we not seeing now? Who are we not protecting? And what systems are we trusting that maybe we shouldn't? The monsters are real, and they're counting on us to look the other way.